In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is our fifth meeting of our new class entitled Our Struggle, meaning the struggle of the True Orthodox Christians of the 20th and 21st centuries against the heresy of ecumenism. Our first four sessions were devoted to going through the article by Bishop Maximus of our church, of our GOC church, entitled Why the True Orthodox Are Truly Orthodox, in which we went through the criteria for breaking communion with a heretical bishop, the actual events which led to the True Orthodox of Greece breaking communion with the state church and forming an independent hierarchy, and questions regarding and the actual issues of the new calendar and the heresy of ecumenism. And our classes were mainly concerned with the Greek church because that, of course, that was the main subject of His Grace's article. And we're going to come back to the chronology of the GOC of the Church of Greece. We made references to the chronology in our first four classes, but we didn't do a precise chronology. We're going to come back to the chronology, and we're going to, in reference to the chronology, we're going to talk about the different divisions that occurred, especially, well, there's the big division with the Matthewites, and there are also divisions within the Florinites that occurred in the late 70s and through the 80s and 90s. And thank God, right now we've reached a point of stasis and of a great unity within the Greek calendar church. But it was a hard road to travel to get here, and so it's important for us to know the history. But before that, we're going to make a little side trip into the history of the Russian Church abroad, because the Russian Church abroad, of course, is very important, very key to understanding the struggle against ecumenism in the 20th century, because the Russian Church abroad, really for a couple of decades, the Russian Church abroad took the lead on the world stage in the struggle against ecumenism. There's a fundamental difference between the Russian Church abroad, a couple of fundamental differences between the Russian Church abroad and the Greek calendar church. The Greek calendar church was in Greece, and their focus was almost entirely within Greece, within Greek affairs, within Greek concerns. The Russian Church abroad was an international church because the Russian diaspora was scattered over the face of the earth. And so there ended up being parallel Russian Church abroad hierarchies in the countries, not only countries in the non-Orthodox or the historically non-Orthodox diaspora, but even in historically Orthodox countries. And the Russian Church abroad hierarchy was always extremely concerned about what was going on in the other local churches. And also the Russian Church abroad was part of its mission, besides preserving Orthodoxy, its mission was to tell the world about the persecution of the faith in the Soviet Union. So they were carrying out both an ecclesiastical and a diplomatic and geopolitical mission. It was far beyond the scope of anything the Greek calendar church was dealing with. So they just had a different path, a different history. Of course, their histories coincided when hierarchs of the Russian Church abroad were approached by the GOC of Greece, by our clergy and faithful, to provide a hierarchy in the early 1960s. The more zealous, you might say, the more I don't want to say holier, because I don't want to imply that the other men did not have some personal holiness, but the more well-known and admired hierarchs in the Russian Church abroad, such as St. John Maximovich and Archbishop of Verki, Archbishop Leonti of Chile, Archbishop Nikon of Washington, among them Bishop Philothea of Hamburg, were very much in favor of helping the Greek calendarists. And I'm not saying that the other bishops were not. The other bishops were concerned about canonical regularity. And at that time, in the 50s and 60s, they weren't quite sure they really wanted to break communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate or the Antiochian Patriarchate and so forth. But so it's a fascinating history of these two groups that in some ways are very different, but they were united by their love for Orthodoxy and their concern. They're coming from very different angles, you might say, but seeing what was going on in the world and the need to join forces to fight ecumenism and to fight modernism and the forces that were attacking Orthodoxy, in particular, and Christian civilization in general. So as a bridge talking about the Russian Church, I want to discuss a very good article about the history of the Russian Church abroad and the Greek calendarists, the history of the Russian Church abroad's relationship with the Greek calendarists. See, and I must say this is the very best thing I've seen in English. I don't even know if a similar document exists precisely that covers all the territory the way this does in Russian or Greek. This might be a unique document insofar as how well it summarizes the history between the Russian Church abroad and the Greek calendarists. And it's a very well-researched and very honest article. It's by a man named Subdeacon Nectarios, who is a ROCOR MP, minor clergyman. He's a subdeacon in the Russian Church abroad that's under the Moscow Patriarchate. And yet the article is very sympathetic to our church, and it's very sympathetic and presents in a very positive light the bishops who provided the ordinations to the Greek Calendar Church. And Subdeacon Nectarius is part of there is a group, I don't know how large, but there are very respected and very thoughtful people who are in ROCOR MP, who became part of that union, so-called in 2007, or who came into the church, or the ROCOR MP after that point, who are nevertheless still very sympathetic to our church, and they're still very concerned about ecumenism. Subdeacon Nectarius writes articles where he says, the Moscow Patriarchate hasn't repented of Sergianism. So how they stay under the Moscow Patriarchate, that's another subject. That's getting back to our dialogue with our conservative World Orthodox friends that we were having with Bishop Maximus in our first 4 classes. All right, but it's a very good article. It's a very well-researched article, and he went to some of our people also to get some of this information, and he has a good working relationship with people in our jurisdiction, as well as obviously his connections in the Russian Church abroad, Moscow Patriarchate. The late Metropolitan Hilarion, God rest his soul, was always very gracious about letting our people into the archives on Park Avenue, even after we were no longer in an ecclesiastical relationship. So we have access to these things, and none of this was really hidden. I mean, it's well documented how St. John Maximovich, for one, a very powerful voice, of course, was in favor of the ordinations. He and Archbishop Verki refrained from participating in the ordinations because they did very much respect Metropolitan Anastasi. They were very concerned about canonical regularity. These men were not cowboys. They were great churchmen. They were very concerned about canonical regularity. But they also stood up and defended Vladika Seraphim of Chicago, Caracas, and Archbishop Leonti, who. And they said, well, look, we have to look beyond the letter of the canons to the spirit and to the situation in the world today. And that's a whole area of discussion we're going to have when we get into the Russian Church abroad's history, both the origins in Russia and then the Church abroad when it was abroad. The subject of the letter of the canons, and then the necessity of our time, and how sometimes you can't go by the letter of the canons if you're going to be faithful to Orthodoxy. You have to go by the spirit of the canons and by the purpose of the canons. Okay, so here's an article. I've never corresponded with Subdeacon Nectarius. He is in communication with our bishop and with people in our church, and he's sympathetic to our church. Also, Bishop Luke of Jordanville is another key figure in Church Abroad, MP, who's sympathetic to our church. And from the point of view of many of the older clergy, and I guess at least Bishop Luke, I don't know about the other bishops, but they've never really formally rejected or renounced the ordinations. They've never formally withdrawn or quote unquote repented of the ordinations or of having been in communion with us. And of course we tell our faithful not to commune in ROCOR MP because they're under the Moscow Patriarchate. But we know that our faithful are welcome. From the other end, our faithful are welcome to commune at Jordanville and at other ROCOR MP sites, so to speak. So it's not a hard and fast relationship at this point. We have sympathetic people there, and there are people, to give them credit, there are people within ROCOR MP who are very concerned about the fact that the MP has still not gotten out of ecumenism and is still not renounced Sergianism, and so it's a subject we should pray for them, and we should keep an open door for our friends who are unfortunately under the Moscow Patriarchate. Okay, so here's Subject Nectarius. He starts with a reference to a recent video that Metropolitan Demetrius did. Introduction. So the title is Russian Orthodox Church Abroad and the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece, A History, published June 30th on his blog, Orthodox Traditionalist. It's a nice blog, orthodoxtraditionalist.com. He doesn't only have controversial articles about ecumenism and so forth. He has some interesting historical articles, various things. Introduction. History for many people is something they do not invest very much time into learning. For the majority of people, history has all but been relegated to the back burner of their interests as something that does not affect the present and does not personally affect them. Therefore, it is of non-importance. Most people do not study history outside of what is compulsory in grade school or high school, which of course now is less and less. And what you study is ridiculous, right? Let alone volunteering for any type of formal education in history at the collegiate, undergraduate, or graduate level. How many of us have seen on social media videos of people quizzing others on elementary historical questions about the United States, asking them such things as how many states there are and what year was the United States founded, or even what is the capital of the United States, and with sad results. Most cannot even answer those simple questions. That's a good question. What year was the United States founded? What's the stock answer? 1776. But what year was our independence recognized by the Crown? 1783. 1783. So from the British point of view, the United States began in 1783, because that was the year that. And there was a recent article I read. I'm sorry to get this footnote, but it's fascinating. It's not exactly on the subject, but I've never read, even though I always was an American history junkie. I had never read the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which is the formal recognition of the United States by the British Crown, and the formal cessation of hostilities between the rebels and the Crown, and the recognition of the United States as a nation. And the treaty begins in the name of the Holy Trinity. It says the Holy Trinity has moved the hearts of His Majesty George III and the hearts of the people of the United States to reconcile to each other. So it begins with thoroughly Christian. For us Orthodox, that's a very interesting note, right? So we can talk about that when we do our Orthodoxy in America class. We can talk about that. Okay. So most people don't. But most people, we've seen these videos, where they say, well, when was World War II? And they say, well, was that Vietnam, or things like that. So this same lack of historical interest has greatly seeped into the culture of the Orthodox Church, among laity and to a lesser degree the clergy, of course, because trends in the culture do affect people in the church. So the ignorance of history is widespread also among our people. And he goes and talks about, we don't need to dwell on this, he goes and talks about attention spans being diminished and so forth. He says, this has a great effect on us in the Orthodox Church because Orthodox Christians cannot afford to not know and understand history, of course. Promulgating the evangelism efforts of the Orthodox Church requires us to know history to a certain degree, and there's no way around this. Merely learning it from TikTok and YouTube doesn't work. Right. So, unbeknown to many people, they have recently been presented with a very unknown but very well-documented history of the genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece and their long history and relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. This small and unknown subject of Orthodox Church history from the 1930s to 2006 is primarily discussed among historical and academically minded so-called old calendarist Orthodox Christians and in smaller circles within the Russian Church outside Russia and never in the New Calendar jurisdictions. And that's true. The New Calendarists, especially the Greek New Calendarists, the old calendarists are a best-kept secret. They don't want their people to know that we exist. And it's as if we're on Mars. When presented with this history, the most universal default reaction by most Orthodox is, especially in the modernist jurisdictions, is just to be aggressive and against these Orthodox Christians and against the Russian Church abroad. And now everybody praises John Maximovich and praises Matron Filaret, but not in their lifetimes. They were regarded as schismatics, and they were attacked by what became the OCA and by the Greek New Calendarists and so forth. Just fanatics. When Father Seraphim Rose was publishing his work in the 60s and 70s, the people at St. Vladimir's Seminary would speak of them as just being ignorant, fanatic, the bumpkins, and not worthy of attention, beneath contempt, not even worthy of paying attention to such people. Okay, so what he's saying really is that most people in world Orthodoxy don't know anything about this, and they just buy this mainstream narrative that we're a bunch of crazies and schismatics and sectarians and we eat babies and so forth. So he goes on. I present to you this subject as an historian, as historically objective as I can, that you are able to, in the recent words of Metropolitan Demetrius of the Genuine Orthodox Christians of America, to think objectively, to have a little bit of critical thinking, perhaps even open-mindedness. That's the videos that our Metropolitan recently made, addressed to, our Metropolitan is getting, he said, thousands of queries, mostly from Greek New Calendarists, who are very upset about, worried about what's going on. They're realizing that we exist, and they're wondering why we exist. And they've been told that we are schismatics, that we're heretics, that we're fanatics, and we're graceless, and so forth and so on. Of course, they're told the Roman Catholics are not graceless. But we are, testifying that they indeed have the same religion as the Roman Catholics, and not the same religion as the Orthodox Christians. But so these people, these are well-meaning people within the New Calendar or World Orthodox jurisdictions who just don't know about the history of the old calendars, don't know about the history of the Russian Church abroad, but all the evidence is out there. That's the most important things now. All the evidence is out there. You just have to take time to study it. Okay, he says it's a complex subject, and he wants people to cease promulgating unorthodox behavior and attitudes to those who share our Orthodox faith and also desire the defeat of the heresy of ecumenism among the Orthodox Church everywhere. This history is by no means exhaustive, but will be my small offering, he says, to help people to think more critically, historically, and compassionately about our true brothers and sisters in Christ. So he's writing as someone within World Orthodoxy, saying the old calendars are our true brothers and sisters. They're not schismatics. They're not non-Orthodox. They are Orthodox Christians, and they are not schismatic. So he's addressing mostly his fellow ROCOR MP people, to say, hey, look, our church was in communion with these people, and we've never really renounced them. We've never really formally broken with them. All right, so let's go back to the beginning. Now, it's a complex subject because initially, the 30s through the 50s, although the ROCOR hierarchy was sympathetic to the Greek old calendarists, they were still trying to maintain a canonical relationship with the State Church of Greece and with the Ecumenical Patriarchy. Okay, so remember, as I think I put out in an earlier class, ROCOR didn't end up being isolated so much because she formally broke communion with these groups as they demanded her. They turned their backs on her after World War II and started recognizing the Moscow Patriarchate instead of the Russian Church abroad, whereas before World War II it had been the opposite. The Russian Church abroad is recognized as the canonical hierarchy, and the Soviet-controlled church was recognized for being a non-canonical or untrustworthy group. Okay. So he begins. The history of the relationship between the Russian Church abroad and the Greek Old Calendar churches is a long history stretching from 1926 till roughly 2007, when the Russian Orthodox Church abroad reunited with the Moscow Patriarchate. Now I'm going to stop and make little footnotes. The Russian Church abroad did not reunite with the Moscow Patriarchate. The Russian Church abroad, as a church hierarchy, became into existence in 1920. The Moscow Patriarchate was created by Stalin in 1941. The Russian Church abroad was never under the Moscow Patriarchate. Okay, it's older. The Russian Church abroad is a canonical continuation of the pre-revolutionary church. What we call the Moscow Patriarchate is a church administration uncanonically created by Stalin in the 1940s. And what he did was he went and found there were a few bishops left alive, and they went, basically, they had a few of their cronies that were under Metropolitan Sergius and then Alexis Simansky. And then but they didn't have enough to have an election for patriarchs. They went into the Gulag, and they basically asked a question, will you vote for Sergius? And if they said no, they stayed in jail. If they said yes, they came out of jail. And they couldn't even find bishops. They had to find some Archimandrites and make them bishops in order to have this election, so-called election. Of course, an election, Sergius wasn't any more elected than Joe Biden was. I mean, it was more blatant, much more blatant actually than that. The men they selected to be this Moscow Patriarchate were Most of them were among the renovationists from the Living Church in the 1920s. So it was a thoroughly unsavory group to begin with, and it was created by Stalin. So saying my objection to reunited is not a quibble. It's a very important point. The Russian Church abroad, which had a canonical confessing hierarchy, was subsumed by an artificial creation that we call the Moscow Patriarchate. So when I have little quibbles with him, or big quibbles, I'll point it out. The beginnings of the Old Calendar resistance movement began to take shape in Greece in April of 1926. And the relationship and dialogue with the Russian Church abroad shortly thereafter. I don't know why he chooses April of 26, but it's, of course, after the calendar change of 24. The history of this dialogue begins with the entrance of the ecumenical patriarchate into the modern 20th century ecumenical movement, first with a heretical encyclical and then with the calendar innovation, which we've covered in our earlier classes. The genesis of this story begins with the Church of Constantinople under patriarchal locum tenens, Dorotheus of Brusa and 10 other metropolitans who published an encyclical entitled To the Churches of Christ Wheresoever They May Be, addressing the heretical denominations outside the Holy Orthodox Church as fellow heirs and partakers of the same promise of God in Jesus Christ. This title of this encyclical already presupposed that the Church was not one. Its intent was to open an ecumenical dialogue with all the different heterodox bodies on an equal footing. The first item in this agenda proposed the adoption of a common festal calendar so that all the churches could celebrate the great Christian feast simultaneously, thereby taking the first steps into the heresy of modern ecumenism. He actually has a photograph. There's the cover of the infamous encyclical. There it is. And apparently it's in a French translation. It's Greek with the French translation because, of course, then French was still the diplomatic international language in the more civilized times. French was the international language. In 1924, when the new calendar innovation was forced upon the Greek Orthodox Christians in Greece by the infamous heresiarch Meletios Metaxakis, it was with the cooperation of the government and the State Church of Greece, of course. Actually, not the cooperation of the government made the church do it. Right? The government, and of course, the government in cooperation with Meletios and with Chrysostomos Papadopoulos, who was the Archbishop in Athens. They were all brother Masons. This is the Venizelos government. Venizelos was an infamous modern, secularist modernist Mason. It was the struggle in Greece was between the Venizelites and the Royalists. At this point, the Venizelites were in power, and they pushed through this innovation. It was only the fathers on Mount Athos and very pious lay people and some clergy who refused to bend the knee to this sudden change in the traditional church calendar. From 1924 to 1935, it was these pious Orthodox Christians alone who resisted without the protective homophorian of an Orthodox hierarch. These Orthodox Christians who refused to accept the non-canonical calendar innovation began to be persecuted by the State Church of Greece for refusing to accept the new calendar, one example being the martyrdom of Catherine Routis in Mandra, who was struck on the head by the Greek police. Here she is. There's a picture of St. Catherine. Sadly, the parish church where this happened is now under the new calendar because they've grabbed many of our churches. But it happened in a parish in Mandra, and the policeman was going to strike her priest with his rifle butt, and she interposed herself and she got hit on the head. She was a young mother, and she died from the wound. So she's a martyr. She's a holy martyr. On April 24, 1926, the State Church of Greece issued a very strict encyclical directed against the traditional Orthodox Christians. The encyclical states, they separate themselves from the church and cut themselves off from the body of Christ, drawing upon themselves condemnation and excommunication, not knowing or perhaps forgetting that he who does not hear the churches is the heathen man and the publican. The decisions of the church are absolutely obligatory. He who does not obey them no longer belongs to her. He is deprived of the means of divine grace. He is separated and cut off from her, is liable to eternal torment. So the very first proclamation of gracelessness was not by old calendarists against the state church. It was the state church against the old calendarists. Okay? And it's funny when they're dealing with the heretics, or the Roman Catholics and Protestants. They're very soft and loving and open, and they don't condemn anyone. But when it comes to the old calendarists, they're very old-fashioned, and they become so traditional and such upholders of canonical order. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Despite this targeted encyclical against the community of the Orthodox Christians in Greece who were actively resisting the calendar innovation, They continued on in their struggle without a bishop till 1935. On May 25th, 1935, the community of the Old Calendar Orthodox Christians requested of 3 different Greek Orthodox bishops to take their community under their omophorion. These 3 bishops were Metropolitan Germanos of Dimitrias, the retired Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florina, and Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Zakynthos. These 3 bishops, who had been actively trying to return the Church of Greece to the traditional church calendar to no avail, agreed to take the Old Calendar's community under their protection and form the Old Calendar Church of Greece, which elected Metropolitan Germanos as their synodal first hierarch. This, in brief, is how the genuine Orthodox Church of Greece and the Old Calendarist movement began. Well, of course, the movement began in 1924. But this is how a hierarchy was formally established. Sadly, Chrysostomos of Zakynthos went back to the new calendar, but Chrysostomos of Florina and Germanos Dimitriatos remained Old Calendar, and they consecrated other bishops to perpetuate the hierarchy. And I believe I pointed out in an earlier class that Metropolitan Germanos of Dimitrias and Chrysostomos of Florina were extremely eminent churchmen. They were not marginal, minor, unknown churchmen. Chrysostomos of Florina was probably the most eminent churchman of his generation in the Greek church, respected by everyone, including the future Patriarch Athenagoras, who was his deacon at one time, and regarded him as a spiritual father and esteemed him greatly. And Metropolitan Germanos Dimitriados was the secretary of the Holy Synod of the State Church of Greece. So these people were very eminent. They were not yahoos off from the corner somewhere. It is true that later on in the Greek Old Calendar movement, that the episcopate was drawn largely from Athonite monks who were less formally educated and were less used to being administrators, not used to being princes of the church, but were simply monastics who were very zealous. And that created kind of a narrowing focus, right? But originally, this first generation of Greek Old Calendar bishops were eminent, highly educated, urbane clergymen of a very Catholic mindset. Not fanatics, it was not zeal, not according to knowledge, in other words, but very carefully thought out canonical position on their part. Now, at this early stage, 1920, 1935, the ROCOR involvement was very limited. Now, here's the part that we have to be very honest about the Russian Church. The Russian Church Abroad's move away from World Orthodoxy and towards the Old Calendarists was gradual. So the Old Calendarists, from 1924 on, they knew what the side they were on. They're against the New Calendarists. Period. Okay. The Russian Church Abroad was coming from a different viewpoint. They were concerned about the patriarchates recognizing the Russian Church Abroad as the legitimate canonical hierarchy of the Russian Church, as opposed to the Moscow Patriarchate. Because so much of their mission was to get World Orthodoxy to support the persecuted Christians in Russia. See, of course, they were disappointed, and as you'll see later on in a letter by Metropolitan Anthony, where he says, "I'm not going to." The Metropolitan Anthony, in the same letter, he says, "I don't approve of breaking." He's telling a non-commemorator, "Don't break with the state church, but they hate me because I'm not for the new calendar. I'm not for their modernism." So they started getting the door slammed in their face right away, but they kept trying until the tenure of Metropolitan Philaret. They really kept trying very hard to stay in some kind of canonical relationship with the other patriarchates outside of Russia. You see, they tried really hard, and they kept getting the door slammed in their face and kept getting kicked around. They realized that for the ecumenical patriarchate, for example, was very corrupt, even early on. There's a story of Metropolitan Anthony. When the White Russians departed from Odessa, went across the Black Sea, they were going to Serbia, but they were in Constantinople for a while. So Metropolitan Anthony was staying at the Fanar in Constantinople, and it was Sunday, so he was going to come down and join the other bishops and concelebrate. And he came down, and they were all these bishops were having breakfast on Sunday morning. He said, "Oh, Vladika, come sit down, have some bacon and eggs, or whatever, I don't know, whatever, feta and, cream in your coffee or whatever." So he was shocked. He was just, he couldn't believe it. It was just, and then he started realizing, we're not in Kansas anymore. These people are not, there's something really wrong with these people. See? So they were realizing early on, when they started actually encountering the ecumenical patriarchate in real life, they realized that this organization is already deeply corrupted, right? But they still tried very hard to have relationships with them right into the 1960s. Well, thus their hesitancy in ordaining the old calendarists. Okay. Now this is important. Okay. As I previously mentioned, the author says, the heretical encyclical issued by the Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to the Churches of Christ, whosoever they may be, was published in 1920, and the non-canonical calendar change took place in 1924. And the official formation of our episcopate of the old calendarists took place into 1935. It should be noted that this encyclical that we're talking about, the Churches of Christ Everywhere, did not have far-reaching effects outside the Greek world. And according to Metropolitan Germanos of Dimitrios, he had requested this publication 3 times for the documents of the patriarchates to be deposited, and they were not deposited. Therefore, they were not read, so that I and the hierarchy could be enlightened. The 1920 encyclical, though printed, was not disseminated. It was only in 1949 that it gradually became known. So they were being sneaky. They were sending this thing to the Anglicans and the Catholics, but they didn't want the Orthodox to know about it. See? And this goes on to this very day, where a World Orthodox bishop will go to a WCC meeting or to the Vatican and really do terrible things, sign terrible statements and pray with the Pope and so forth. Then they'll go back home and give a beautiful Orthodox sermon and act like nothing happened. Their own faithful have no idea that their Despota, their Velika, their Sayedna is a heretic, an apostate, because they're always playing a double game. So, of course, now it's not really anymore. It's pretty much out in the open. But back then they were still hiding these things. So it's not the point the author is making. It's not incomprehensible by any means that the Russian bishops would not know about the 1920 encyclical. So even the Greek bishops who were trying to get to the bottom of this thing had a hard time extracting a copy of it from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, because the Ecumenical Patriarchate was afraid of what the reaction would be. You see, that how their plans would be, how the fact that the calendar change was preceded by this little this opening move towards ecumenism. He goes on. With the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia itself only having been formed in 1920, the interaction with those in the old counter-resistance movement at these early stages was very limited. However, the first interactions we do have are archived letters from Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky, the first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad, who wrote multiple letters to a monk in Mount Athos concerning the old counter movement in 1926, 9 years before the formation of our hierarchy, of the GOC. In this letter, below it can be seen that Metropolitan Anthony was not in favor of the resistors ceasing commemoration of the new calendar bishops at the time of his writings. So when he writes these letters in 1926, he's saying, I don't agree with your not commemorating. Okay, because remember, this is very early in the whole process. It can be surmised from the language in the letters that because of this innovation that divided the Church of Greece was in fact still a fresh issue, that he might have expected that a council would rectify the situation sooner rather than later, let alone over 100 years later and counting, where it still hasn't happened. So it's very early. He's saying, this is going to get fixed. Surely the Greeks aren't going to put up with this. This is going to get fixed soon. Right? So in letter number 98, by the way, I believe these letters are numbered by the late Archbishop Nikon, who was Metropolitan Anthony's biographer. I think that's who numbered these letters. And by the way, Archbishop Nikon was one of the pro-Greek calendar bishops in the early 60s. But he's also a great admirer and might say the official biographer of Metropolitan Anthony. So he's writing to Hieroschema monk Theodosius of Manathos. I'm sure my more learned Greek friends know who this Father Theodosius is. I think this is Father Theodosius of Carulia, but I'm not sure. Honorable Father Theodosius, Lydia Cantoni is writing now. I've never approved of the new style, nor those who adhere to this style. I hope that if we overcome our ecclesiastical turbulence, the Church, under the threat of excommunication, will demand a return to the old style. So he says there should be a council, and they should demand a return under threat of excommunication. So he feels strongly about the old style. However, you are surely aware of the 13th canon of the first second, which imposed the deprivation of the priesthood and clergy who break communion with the metropolitan before being judged. Here's the great question. Is it heresy or not? Okay. But I don't know if Metropolitan Anthony was aware of the anathematizations of 1583 and later. See, that's another question. Which documents which pan-Orthodox decisions were even some of the bishops even aware of? See. That is why I was disappointed that your followers did not receive antitheron in the New Style monasteries. You especially should have been cautious, as neither you nor those with you have bishops who share your views. At this time, we didn't have bishops, right? Thus approaching the priestless, and at the very least, schismatics in general. Your zeal is praiseworthy, but self-will and anticipating judgment on the hierarchs are hardly praiseworthy. Applying the canons prohibit joint prayer with heretics and schismatics, and by continuing the latter, not accepting antitheron as a sign of communion, you introduce something new and enticing. Well, sincerely respecting... So apparently these non-commemorators were going to church in the ruling monasteries that they were registered with, but they were not taking antitheron, much less communion. While sincerely respecting your fasting endeavors, meaning your asceticism, I would like an explanation for these actions if you do not consider it beneath you, as well as forgiveness from you for my direct words. Isn't this beautiful, so elegant, so humble? If you do not consider it beneath you. He's writing to a monk. He's a bishop, right? So Metropolitan Anthony was a great churchman, and he was a great man. Right? Great soul, megalopsychia, great-souled man. I request your holy prayers, invoking God's blessing upon you and seeking forgiveness on the Holy 40. It's right before Lent. I remain your sincere well-wisher, Metropolitan Anthony, 8/21 March, 1932. Oh, I thought Father said this is 26.
I think the 32 heading is for the second.
Oh, the next letter.
Yes.
And here he's quoting this canon this canon 13 of the First Second Council. That's footnote 7. By the way, those listening to the recording, I strongly encourage you to get on the web, look at this article, and follow along while we're reading. No, it's just a reference to the letter. All right. So the point is, apart from, and now here's another letter number 99. He says, "Rejoice! It is heard from everywhere. The Greeks want to return to the old style, and then your perplexity will end." He said it's heard everywhere. Of course, it still hasn't happened, right? It's 2023, and it hasn't happened. So this is the context within which Antony is writing, is that this whole thing is very new. He says, don't break communion yet. It's too early. And because everybody knows this is going to come in and this is going to get fixed. And a lot of the old calendars thought it was, too, that this is going to get fixed pretty soon. Like, how long can this can't go on. This can't stand. Right? It's so uncanonical it can't go on. Right? So again, it's another letter. I won't read the whole thing, but it's another letter from Metropolitan Anthony saying that he disapproves of the new style, but he still doesn't want to break communion with the State Church of Greece or with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. April 18th, 1932. All right. So the author goes on to explain. The context of Metropolitan Anthony's letter to higher schema monk Theodosius is that he is writing concerning season commemoration of the new calendar bishops in Greece and the Patriarch of Constantinople. As with the rest of the old calendar priests who joined the resistance movement, they seized commemoration of the Patriarch and the other new calendar bishops because of the perceived schism that was created by Melchizedek Success's innovation. Metropolitan Anthony, agreeing that the new calendar was repugnant, to use his words, was not at this period in time in agreement with seizing communion with the new calendarists or the Patriarch. As we can see from the previous history contained the heretical encyclical to the churches of Christ, whosoever they might be, that was signed and published by the Synod of the Patriarch of Constantinople, was little known to most of the Greek hierarchs, so in all probability it would have not been known to Metropolitan Anthony as well, which would have deprived him of additional historical context concerning the problematic road the Ecumenical Patriarchate was beginning to travel down, besides his own experience with them eating breakfast before liturgy on Sunday morning. What is not in the context of this letter is the subject of parallel jurisdictions, which is defaulted to by many Orthodox Christians in the modernist jurisdictions. These letters by Metropolitan Anthony were penned March-April of 32, at which point in time the old Council Synod was not yet in existence. They had no bishops. Right? So for these letters, the topic was not yet on the table for discussion. There was no parallel jurisdictions. There was no question of having our own bishops. On October 11th, 1934, George Paraskos and Basil Stamatoulis, the President and Secretary General of the Community of the Genuine Orthodox Christians, in the attempt to officially come under the amophorion of an Orthodox hierarch, appealed to the ROCOR Synod and Metropolitan Anthony with the hopes that he would consecrate bishops for them. So the first appeal from the GOC to the ROCOR was in 34, even before we even had, because in 34, there were no bishops. Just the three bishops came back in 1935. However, nothing came of this, presumably because by this time Metropolitan Anthony's health was in decline. Metropolitan Anthony would repose in the Lord in August 1936, 21 months after this petition from the old countess in Greece, 15 months after the establishment of the Synod of the Genuine Orthodox Church of Greece. After the repose of Metropolitan Anthony, the Russian Orthodox Church abroad elected as the first hierarch Anastasius, or Anastasi Gribanovsky, in 1936. Metropolitan Anastasi, when it came to the ROCOR policy concerning the church calendar, remained closely in line with his predecessor, Metropolitan Anthony. Metropolitan Anastasi says concerning the new calendar innovation that our church remains loyal to the use of the old calendar and considers the introduction of the new calendar to be an error. Nevertheless, its tactic was always to preserve spiritual unity with Orthodox churches, even those who have adopted the new calendar, but only to the degree to which they celebrate Pascha in compliance with the decision of the First Ecumenical Council. Our church has never labeled the Ecumenical Patriarchate or the Greek Archdiocese of North and South America as schismatic, never abrogated spiritual union with them. That's footnote 11. He's just quoting from a study, from a website called ROCOR Studies. So it's a letter by Metropolitan Anastasi. However, this would unfortunately change within the Russian Church abroad because the heretical ecumenism, unfortunately because of that ecumenism is unfortunate, that these modernist jurisdictions would further go into such that her ties with her sister old calendar churches in Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria would be supported and strengthened. In other words, Metropolitan Anastasi is writing in the 30s when ecumenism is just getting started. It's not obvious at all, right? Not obvious at all. So their objection to the Moscow Patriarchate is that, or what became the Moscow Patriarchate in the 1930s, it wasn't even Moscow Patriarchate; it was just the Surgeonists. Their objection to that group is that they're under control of the Soviet government. They were troubled by the change of the calendar, but there was no World Council of Churches till 1948. There were no concelebrations with the Pope or with Protestants, much less witch doctors and so forth, going in the 1930s. So in the Russian Church abroad's point of view, the new calendar is unfortunate, but they're not so far gone. We need to strengthen unity among the Orthodox, not break communion over the calendar change. Whereas the old calendars in Greece, they were in the trenches. They were dealing with this in their daily lives, right? And they came to the realization of how serious this was earlier than the Russian Church abroad, which was dealing with a whole other set of problems. The Russian Church abroad had so many of their own problems on various fronts. Okay. Next section, the Russian Church abroad and the old calendar hierarchical revival. So now he's going to get into the period where the ordinations took place. Over the course of time, and no doubt through God's providence, Father Petros Astivitis, and by the way, I recommend to everyone to watch Bishop Christodoulos' two-part biography of Metropolitan Petros on Greek Orthodox television. It's beautifully done. It's very inspiring. Through God's providence, Father Petros Astivitis, a key figure of the Greek Old Calendar movement in the United States, while traveling through Grand Central Station on December 25th, New Style, 1954, would come across Archbishop Averki of Jordanville and Archbishop Leonti of Chile, both of whom were on their way to Holy Trinity Monastery. As circumstance happens, these three traditional Orthodox clergymen were taking the same train north through Manhattan. So I've heard the story of this. Of course, the Russian bishops didn't speak Greek, and the Greek bishop didn't speak Russian, and none of them spoke English. So they just looked at each other, and they said, one of them said, "Christmas?" And the other one said, "No, St. Spiridon." And they went, "Brothers, we're brothers."
Shibboleth.
Huh?
Shibboleth.
Yeah, we're the shibboleth. Yes, they knew. That was the code, right? That was the password. So it was on this day in 1954 that sparked a lifelong friendship between Archbishop Averki, Archbishop Leonti, and Father Petros, who would later be consecrated to the episcopacy by Archbishop Leonti in the Cathedral of St. Marcella in Astoria, New York. So remember, so many things, we read church history, we think about official proceedings and canons and, synodical decisions and protocols and ukazes and encyclicals, but everything starts with a human contact. Everything starts with a human relationship. There has to be that heart-to-heart communication to understand, who are you with? Whose side are you on? And these men saw this in each other, right? They saw that this bishop's really Orthodox. Or these bishops, he wasn't even a bishop yet. He was a priest, archimandrite, or Father Petrus. These bishops saw in him, a true brother in Christ. Okay. After the traditionalist Greek Orthodox Christians learned of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, whom they also saw as resistors to the calendar change, to modernism and the heresy of ecumenism, they eventually petitioned Metropolitan Anastasi and the Holy Synod to consecrate for them bishops for their church. However, Metropolitan Anastasi, not wanting to get involved in Greek jurisdictional affairs, always turned them down. This, however, did not spoil the friendship between the Russian and Greek clergymen that was created that fateful day on the feast of St. Spiridon in Grand Central Station. Of all places, Grand Central Station, right? So, where sin abounded, grace abounded more. And in the in part 2 of the bio of Hierro de Petros, Bishop Christodolos goes into that great hall in Grand Central Station. He says this is where it happened. This is where they read into each other. Okay. Now, around 1955, the 11 old calendarist Orthodox priests who were living in New York City, still trying to rectify their situation and come under the omophorion of a traditionalist Greek Orthodox hierarch, gathered at the old Church of St. Nicholas in New York, once located at what is today Ground Zero. I know have any of y'all been in New York before 9/11? Or I guess, no, I'm dating myself. I mean, of course not, unless you go when you were a child, right? So there's a beautiful little Greek Orthodox church right at the foot of the World Trade Center. That's an old calendar church. It was an old calendar church in at least the 1950s. I'm not sure when the Greek Archdiocese grabbed it, but it was destroyed. It was just, of course, pulverized when the towers pancaked and smashed it. And now they built this monstrosity of a modernist, ecumenical, world globalist pseudo-Orthodox church there to be, 9/11 brother, universal brotherhood symbol and all that sort of thing. But it was a charming little, very pious little church of St. Nicholas. I believe it was a church for mariners, right? It was right down in downtown Manhattan, not far from the harbor. And so it's very traditional, to have a church of St. Nicholas on the Limni, on the shore or the harbor, where mariners go to pray to the saint before they go on their voyages or to offer thanks when they return safely. And so that's where the meeting was held of our clergy in 1955 at that little church of St. Nicholas. Okay. They decided to nominate a priest worthy of the episcopacy whom they could present to a traditional Russian bishop for ordination, and they chose Father Petrus. They approached Archbishop Leonti of Chile, who was at the time part of the North American Metropolia. So Leonti was in the Metropolia, but then he came over to the ROCOR. Unfortunately, Archbishop Leonti was not still willing to cross this line, as it would have had serious ramifications throughout the Orthodox world in the United States and in Europe. And here's a photograph, 1959 photograph of the Russian Church Abroad Synod. There they are. And there's Vladika Anastasi at the head, very old. Vladika Anastasi was the bishop who researched and wrote out the program for enthroning the Patriarch in 1918. He was that eminent. I mean, Anthony Krabovitsky and Anastasi Grabanovsky were two of the most eminent hierarchs in the Russian Orthodox Church before the revolution. This is 1959. And here's Archbishop Verki. There he is. There's Anthony of Geneva. I think that's Bishop Sava, if he was a bishop by then. There's Seraphim of Chicago. There's Antony of Los Angeles. There's Vitali of Montreal. Yeah. So they're very a grave and very very worthy of respect assemblage there of good bishops. Right. In November of 1959, the Synod of the Russian Church Abroad held a meeting, and at this synodal meeting was a discussion concerning those old calendarists who sought the help of ROCOR in consecrating bishops. A large majority of the bishops of the time were well in support of the old calendrist Orthodox Christians. So a majority of the ROCOR bishops, their sentiments were in favor of somehow supporting the old calendarists. Okay. Those in support of them, or at least open to exploring or helping them further, were St. John of San Francisco, Archbishop of Hierarchy of Syracuse, Alexander of Berlin, Bishop Nikon, Bishop Sava of Edmonton, who's Serb, by the way, and Anthony of Los Angeles. Whereas Anthony of Geneva, known for his liberal leanings, was reticent, and Metropolitan Anastasi maintained the position of his predecessor, was not in support of this, and did not want to cause political waves within other jurisdictions. Okay. Of these synodal members, Archbishop of Hierarchy of Syracuse was the most supportive of the old calendarists. He was the most vocal about it. The minutes of the synod have him recorded saying, Bishop of Hierarchy, old calendarists often come to Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville. In Athens, on the Feast of the Cross, a crowd of Greeks came out of Athens with a procession during which the Holy Cross appeared in the sky and photographic pictures were taken. The movement deserves a helping hand. He's remembering he is kind of his version of the appearance of the cross in 1925. Of course, it wasn't. It did take place in a church outside of Athens on Mount Imetos, above Athens. Okay. So he's referring back to the appearance of the cross in 1925. He goes on. He says they are drawn to the truth and we should support them. John of San Francisco can be seen supporting the statement of Archbishop Seraphim of Chicago. So during the meeting, John of San Francisco was the secretary, so he recorded these things. So he can be seen supporting the statement of Archbishop Seraphim of Chicago, who is recorded saying, and Seraphim of Chicago ends up being one of the consecrators of Akakios Papas here in Detroit in 1961. Seraphim of Chicago says he's been interested in this movement for a long time. The old calendarists have 2 or 3 groups, but the strongest is the one that appeals to us. There's a group of bishops, but improperly ordained. He's referring to the Matthewites. Seraphim, he too thought the old calendarists could get help from the Jerusalem Patriarchate, but then he found out he was mistaken. Some fear complications with other Greek churches, but it is possible to conduct the matter in a way that does not cause great complications. However, we must put the truth of the church above our own interests. Archimandrite Nicholas of Washington speaks negatively about the old calendarists. Some Athos has said Archimandrite Nicholas, who himself belonged to the old calendarists, does not have a clearly objective assessment of this movement. Being a partisan, he must be relegated, or it's don't pay attention to him. This Father Nicholas Pekatoris was in Washington for a long time. He was Greek. He had once been an old calendarist, but then he fell out with them, so he said negative things about them. You see, but Vladika Seraphim is saying, don't listen to him, because he's prejudiced. But Vladika Seraphim concludes by saying, the movement deserves all the attention and help it can get. So our author goes on. Although a large portion of the members of the synod supported the old calendarists, they were still cautious moving forward because of the sensitive nature of what was in question and because of the position of Metropolitan Anastasi on the issue. However, even though the synod at that time decided not to act according to the request of the old calendar Orthodox Christians, that was not the end of the road. Within the ROCOR, there were 2 bishops who were willing to help them. These 2 ROCOR bishops, knowing that there was a great need for traditional old calendarist Greek hierarchy in Greece, decided to consecrate a traditionalist Orthodox bishop for the old calendarists. These 2 bishops were Seraphim of Chicago and Theophil of Detroit. Remember, I spoke about Theophilos Ionescu in an earlier class. He was from the Romanians, who the anti-communist non-patriarchal group that was started by Valerian Trifo. And the ROCOR is very sympathetic to them because they were non-communists. So it's funny how the ROCOR, they didn't want to consecrate the Greek old calendarists because they didn't want to offend Constantinople, but they took in these Romanians because they were so anti-communist, because they saw in the Patriarchate of Romania, that's like the Moscow Patriarchate because they're controlled by the state security services, you see. And so you see things are complicated. You can't say they're hypocritical because they were approaching these 2 different jurisdictions, Constantinople and Romania, based on different types of evidence and different concerns. So they were hyper worried about the infiltration of communism. So they felt they had to take in these Romanians who, even though they were on the new calendar, they were very anti-communist. So Theophil Ionescu was one of these people, but he was a legitimate hierarch of the Russian Church abroad at the time he performed the ordination. In 1961, took place at St. Nicholas Church on right off 8 Mile Road in Detroit. You can go there now. There's a beautiful, St. Nicholas's Church, it moved. There's a beautiful Romanian Byzantine-style church on Livernois now in Detroit. But you can go see the old St. Nicholas. It's sad. It was just a humble little white building, and it's been taken over by some kind of sectarian preacher. it's kind of, we visited it once, and it's kind of sad, but it's important to go and see it because, well, this is where it took place. This is where this ordination took place. So Seraphim of Chicago, Archbishop Seraphim of Chicago, Bishop Theophile Ionescu of Detroit. An old calendar of Orthodox priests from Greece was selected on December 9th, 1960 in Detroit. Archbishop Seraphim and Theophile consecrated Akakios Papas, who would lead the genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece. And Archbishop Akakios, I believe, only survived 2 years. And then he was he reposed and was replaced by Archbishop Auxentius. Archbishop Auxentius, by the way, was once a parish priest at St. Spiridon's in Detroit. Almost everybody at one time passed through St. Spiridon's in Detroit. When this became known to Metropolitan Anastasi, as one can imagine, he was not very happy with them. This was not the only ordination of Greek Old Calendars to take place by hierarchs of the ROCOR. In 61, Archbishop Leonti of Chile flew to Athens. Okay, so Akakios Papas was in 1960, and in 61, Vladika Leonti went to Athens, and with Akakios Papas, they consecrated 6 more bishops for the genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece. And here, there's a photograph in the article. Those following along, look at the website, look at the article. There's a photograph on this page. Here they are. Here's Akakios Papas, who was consecrated in Detroit by Seraphim and Theophile. And I believe these others were consecrated by Akakios Papas with Archbishop Leonti of Chile. And they are Auxentius of Gardikion. Here's Auxentius, who became the archbishop. This is Akakios of the Avlia, Chrysostomos Naslimis of Magnesia, and Gerontius of Salamis. And this is Parthenius of the Cyclades, there to our left, next to Archbishop Akakios. That was the original group in the early 60s. And then Auxentius would become the archbishop and be the archbishop until he was deposed in 1986. So 1985, excuse me. We're going to talk about that. That's later on part of our chronology of the Greek Old Calendar Church. And Gerontius of Salamis lived into the 1990s. And Akakios of the Avlia only reposed recently, just within the past few years. So they were long-lived. Of course, when Archbishop Leonti returned from Greece, there was a synod meeting in 1962, which members of the synod were in fact divided among themselves as to whether it was proper for Archbishop Leonti to have consecrated bishops to Greek Old Calendarists. In this meeting, tempers raged. Yes, they were men, right? They got upset with each other. Archbishop Athanasius of Buenos Aires was horrified by what happened. But Archbishop Seraphim said it's totally unacceptable. It's not clear to us who Akakios is, but Archbishop Leonti considers to be a bishop and not an archimandrite. This is all a gamble, and so forth and so on. And the Synod should take no responsibility, should place all responsibility on Archbishop Leonti. It says we need to just completely disavow all this stuff. So that was one viewpoint. However, Bishop Nikon, later Archbishop Nikon of Washington, is reported saying that on the day of his consecration, he was approached by the Greeks to help him leave the Soviet jurisdiction. I'm not sure what Greeks those were. He is aware of the secret ordinations in the Catacomb Church. His heart trembles with joy at the news of the Greek Old Calendars being consecrated. So Archbishop Nikon is comparing these, might say, secret or irregular kind of consecrations to the consecrations of the Catacomb Church in Russia. Okay. He said, frankly, Archbishop Leonti says, we've had a number of canonical violations ourselves. Well, for example, taking in the Romanian New Calendarists because they were anti-communist. Nothing in the canon says you can take a group of bishops because they're anti-communist. right? But it was the right thing to do. So he says, look, we've done the same sort of thing ourselves. See? One should fear God more than men. He answers to God for his deed and does not repent. So Archbishop Leonti stood fast. He said, I did this following my conscience. This is the right thing to do. I fear God more than men. On November 29th, 1962, Archbishop Leonti and Bishop Seraphim of Caracas, who had plans to consecrate Archimandrite Petrus in Caracas, at the last minute decided the consecration would go forth at the Church of St. Marcellus in Astoria, just 5 miles from the ROCOR Synodal headquarters on 93rd. It's 93rd and Park Avenue. The ROCOR Synodal headquarters is it's a beautiful mansion. It was built by Mr. Brown, who built the original Grand Central Station. It's a magnificent Belle Epoque Edwardian era mansion. It's quite a beautiful building. The Synod Cathedral is in the building. The Synod Cathedral is the old ballroom of the mansion. So St. Marcellus, yes, is just the Synod headquarters is in Manhattan. St. Marcellus is in Astoria in Queens. Okay. So Laica Leonti and Laica Seraphim of Caracas consecrated Father Petros to the episcopate on November 29th, 1962 at St. Marcellus in New York. And so there's another heated discussion. Vladica Vitali recalls that Archbishop Leonti lost his temper and was harsh. He said speaks in an impossibly harsh tone. So he got heated. They were letting each other have it. They were fighting over this. Okay. St. John Maximovich, during this meeting, defends Archbishop Leonti. He states that the old countess have been knocking on our door for 6 years. The Council of Bishops could not take a decision recognizing this internal matter of the Greeks. We must accept Archbishop Leonti's explanations as satisfactory and end the debate. Whereas John Maximovich is saying, let's just accept what Vladica did and just drop it. Don't talk about this anymore. Archbishop Aviarki defends Archbishop Leonti. So here's a long quote from Archbishop Aviarki. Standing on the ground of the canons, he would not himself, Laica Aviarki, would not have dared to perform the consecrations of the Greek old calendars. But at the same time, in his heart, he cannot but admire the courage with which Archbishop Leonti committed the act for which his conscience called. That's so Russian. See, the Russians, they always go for the heart. See, the Greeks were debated for hours about the canonical particulars. The Russians just fight it out, and they go to this. My heart says this is the right thing to do. That's the Russian way, right? In his heart, he cannot but admire the courage with which Archbishop Leonti committed the act for which his conscience called. One cannot help but be against the formal violation of the canons. Of course, all these men were well trained and very grave bishops. They knew the canons. They weren't yahoos. I mean, they understood, and they weren't anarchists. They understood the canons. But Vladica Aviarki goes on. But in the life of other churches, we see a continuous violation of the canons. In view of this abnormal general situation, Archbishop Leonti should be treated with leniency. This is further recommended by the fact that there have been a number of illegal acts on the part of the Patriarchate of Constantinople with respect to the Russian Church, such as the rejection of Poland and the Baltic states, the creation of the Exarchate of Paris, the rejection of the bishops Orestes and Bogdan in America. I don't know the story behind Orestes and Bogdan. Now that everything is irrational, there must be a special approach. He's saying everything's in chaos. They're not sticking to the canons, but you're holding us to the canons in their favor. Why? They're violating the canons. Constantinople's stolen Poland and the Baltic states from the Russian church and created fake churches in Poland and Czechoslovakia and the Baltics, and they're cowboys. They're running wild, and we're supposed to be so strict about the canons not to offend them. We're lily pure compared to Constantinople. So why are we being so fastidious about not? They don't care about us. They're stealing the Russian church's historic territory in Europe left and right, as they're doing to this very day, right now. I mean, right now in 2023, right? So why are we so fastidious about the canons in this case, not to offend Constantinople? Okay. And let me go back to what Vladica is saying. He says, again, now that everything is irrational, there must be a special approach. These canons cannot be approached legalistically. The canons are for man, not man for the canons. The Sabbath is for the man, not man for the Sabbath. One must think of the salvation of souls, not the observance of the form alone. The form can be orthodox in appearance and false in substance. In this light, we must evaluate the act of Archbishop Leonti. He performed a courageous act of assistance to a fraternal church, which is now the closest to us in spirit. So this is 62. Lika Vierki is saying the old calendars are the closest to us in spirit. Okay. So now there's all kind of revisionism in ROCOR MP saying that, oh no, only a tiny group of fanatics like the old calendars. The mainstream Russians didn't care about the old calendars. Here's Lika Vierki, who is, let's say, a poster child for everything good about the Russian Church abroad. And saying they're, in 62, he's saying they're the closest to us in spirit. Okay. He goes on, Lika Vierki goes on. The Greek church is now oppressed and persecuted. It was a great mistake that at one time we were too lenient with the introduction of the new calendar. So he's saying, now, he greatly revered Metropolitan Anthony Anastasi. They would never come out and say Anastasi was wrong, Anthony was wrong. But that's what he's implying. He's saying back in the 20s and 30s, apparently, in retrospect, we were wrong to be so soft on the new calendarists. You see? For it was intended to bring a schism into the Orthodox Church. He's recognizing that they did it on purpose to bring a schism in the church. They're bad guys. This wasn't just a temporary... See, Vaticantoni in 32 could be excused for saying it's a temporary problem. But now in 62, 30 years later, Lika Vierki is saying, these are bad guys. They did this on purpose to create problems in the church. You see? It was the work of the enemies of the Church of Christ. The fruits are already visible, even in America, where there are Greek clergy who torment their conscience for the adoption of the new calendar. At that time there were. At that time there were still old clergy who were tormented. Now, I mean, the young guys come out of Holy Cross now, they don't know about the old calendar. Or so I guess some don't. But they don't care. I mean, it's a job. But then there were serious old-fashioned clergy who really were still tormented. They were in the state church, but they're still tormented by the idea that because they remember from childhood, they remembered the old calendar. They still could remember the old calendar. Okay, and there were many grandmothers and moms who disavowed their sons for becoming new calendar clergy. We had a parishioner at St. Spiridon's whose grandmother would not go to her son's funeral because he had become a new calendar bishop. It's like the grandmothers were the ones who said, this is it, we're holding the line. Okay. So anyway, I'm just speaking of that in reference to Lika Vierki saying that there are new calendar clergy who are tormented by this, that they have a conscience, and they're just as there were many clergy who recognized Lika Sergius, who would go home and just beat their heads on the floor doing poklons and tearing their hair out, accusing themselves of being murderers of their brother for being in the KGB church, you see, because their consciences tormented them, even though they were in the legal, quote-unquote, the legal church. Lika Vierki goes on, associated with the observance of the old calendar is the preservation of all kinds of devotions in various areas. Right, it goes along with being pious. Right. Along with the removal of the old calendar is removal of asceticism from the temple. The old calendarists are the ones who are closest to us in spirit, he says again. The only but in Archbishop Leonti's action is that he acted, as it were, unbrotherly in defiance of the decision of the council, though well-meaning. Which is, yes, he didn't have our permission to do this. But I'm going to stick up for him. Okay, the author goes on. As the synodal meeting of November 30th, 62 came to a close, the synod officially drafted a statement which said the following. The Russian Church abroad has never interfered in the affairs of the other autocephalous churches throughout her existence. And for this reason, in spite of her fraternal sympathy with the Greek old calendarists, has continually rejected numerous appeals to her by the Greek old calendarists for the consecration of bishops for them. The Council of Bishops greatly regrets the fact that His Grace Leonti, Archbishop of Chile, Santiago, and Peru, in the month of May 1962, contrary to the above, on his own initiative, without the knowledge and permission of the Synod of Bishops and the First Hierarch Metropolitan Anastasi, participated in the consecration of Greek old calendarists. The Council of Bishops henceforth enjoins the most reverend hierarchs of the Russian Church abroad to refrain from interfering in the affairs of both the Greek and other autocephalous Orthodox churches. As for the participation of some other hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad in the secret consecration of Greek old calendarists hierarchs, as indicated in the correspondence on this issue, neither the Synod of Bishops nor the First Hierarch gave any permission to any bishops for such participation, and they were unaware of the consecrations. Okay, so that's the official position in May of 62. Okay, we've been going for over an hour now, so I think this is a good place to stop. 62, the consecrations have taken place. Vladika Anastasi is still at the helm, and the official position as of May of 62 is still an official non-recognition of the consecrations, and officially slapping Ushers Leonti on the wrist, and by extension, of course, Seraphim of Chicago and Seraphim of Caracas for participating in this. And we'll continue this next time. It's a great saga. It's a great story.